Welcome to day 3 of the Democratic Convention. We're really honored to have a just fantastic panel this morning to talk about innovation and technology challenges, really for what the next presidential administration should be doing, and also the next Congress. So we're going to be joined a few minutes late by a couple of the members, but let me just jump right in and I'll introduce some folks, and then we'll get started. I'm Rob Atkinson. I lead ITIF. For those of you who don't know, we're a think tank in Washington, D.C. that focuses on innovation and tech policy. I'm just going to go down the list here. Down the line here from my right, Jim Greenwood, who's the president and CEO of the biotech. Greenwood, President and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Bio, which is technology is great, isn't it? Try another one. And prior to that, he represented Pennsylvania's 8th District from 1993 to 2005. All right, I'm going to talk loud. Next to Jim is Congresswoman Susan Delbene, who's represented Washington State's 1st District since 2012. She serves on the House Agricultural Committee, the Select Intelligence Panel, and also on 2 subcommittees on Judiciary, the Subcommittee on Courts, IT, and the Internet, and the Subcommittee on Rate Reform, Commercial and Antitrust Law. She's also co-chair of the New Democratic Caucus 21st Century Jobs Working Group, co-chair of the Women's High Technology Caucus, and also a relatively new caucus, the Internet of Things Caucus, where she has been a real leader in educating members of Congress on what IoT is and why it's important. Next to Congresswoman is Rosabeth Cantor. Rosabeth is the Elizabeth Ernest L. Arbuckle Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. If you haven't read any of Rosabeth's 17 books, you are 19. I don't know if I counted them or I found them on the website. But her most recent book is called Move, Putting America's Infrastructure in the Lead. And that one, they're all worth a read. I think I've read 5 of your books, so not all 19. But Rosabeth is really one of the leading scholars in the U.S. on thinking about business and its relation to society. And we're just joined by our good friend Senator Chris Coons, who serves in his 2nd term as a senator from Delaware. He's on the committee including appropriations, foreign relations, judiciary, small business, and ethics. And also Senator Coons is the recent founder of a new caucus in the Senate, Senate Competitiveness Caucus, held that really important new caucus, bipartisan caucus driving competitiveness issues through Congress. And he's also, we're honored, he's the honorary co-chair of ITIF. To my left is Brad Smith, who's the president and legal officer of Microsoft Corporation. And Brad has to leave a little bit early today, as does Senator Coons. So jump right in and be able to have him hear from him. Aaron Egan is the Vice President of U.S. Public Policy and Chief Privacy Officer for Facebook. Next to Aaron is Commissioner Terrell McSweeney, who is a Commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission since 2014 and has played a key role in a lot of the negotiations over European privacy shield issues, among many other things. And finally, David Sapolsky is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel for Amazon. We're going to be joined, and when they come, I'll introduce them. Congressman Scott Peters and Congressman Derek Kilmer. So let me start with a broad question, and maybe to you, Senator. One of the things I think is interesting about this election is the shift, if you will, in trade attitudes toward trade policy, particularly in the Republican Party, where there's been this sort of bottom-up or worry about globalization and are we getting a fair deal and all of that. How do you think we need to respond to that? I mean, clearly, I think one of the good things about that movement,
if you ask me, what's the glass half full is, it does bring needed attention to trade enforcement questions, things like intellectual property that you led on the trade secrets bill recently, which is important legislation to help protect that. It also raises important issues about investing in infrastructure and workforce skills and competitiveness issues. So how do you see that playing?
Well, Rob, thanks first for hosting this, and thanks to everybody on the panel. ITIF is an amazing organization, and in its decade of existence, it really contributes to conversations about innovation. We have a challenge in that, in terms of trade, there are millions of Americans who are convinced that they've been on the short end of the stick when it comes to globalization and trade deals. And first, it prioritizes trade enforcement. The ITIF sort of policy proposals for the 2016 presidential election really focus on a number of concrete and specific proposals that would strengthen trade enforcement going forward. I don't think Americans are fundamentally isolationist and protectionist. I think still the majority of Americans believe we have to engage with the world, and we know the overwhelming majority of consumers of our products and services are outside our borders. So to adopt a Donald Trump perspective on the global economy, not just a 1950s perspective, but a 1750s perspective on how we can improve our economy and improve jobs is the wrong way to go. But we have to persuade the American people that we will be stronger and better and tougher on trade enforcement, on everything from currency manipulation to ripping off American inventions and ideas to short-circuiting some of the enforcement things that they've signed on to but then don't actually follow through on from WTO to other multilateral treaties. I focus on manufacturing as a sector, as an area of priority, because exactly the Americans who have lost their jobs because of globalization are the ones who have a more promising future if we can restore American manufacturing. And the numbers, the news here is actually very good. In the last 6 years, more than 900,000 new jobs created, thousands of jobs in my own home state of Delaware, and I'm sure we were talking about Washington State, and we were talking about other states around the country even more robustly. Our recovery in the manufacturing sector is particularly strong. I know it's easy to get disheartened at a convention, somewhat more disheartened, I hope, at the Republican convention than at ours, because this is a policy-focused group and a policy-focused conversation. But there are areas that we should be able to come together on around tax and trade, immigration, and IP that will make us more competitive. That's why Republican Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas and I formed the Competitiveness Caucus. We've got dozens of members, both sides, who contributed good ideas, and I think that reflects well on the fact that we've got good ideas coming out of ITIF and the participants in this panel today that we can act on moving forward.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I want to take a moment to introduce Congressman Derek Kilmer. Congressman Kilmer, I need my glasses. I could do your bio from memorization, but I was part of the one. So he is serving a second term in Washington's 6th District. He's on House Appropriations, also subcommittees on Interior, Environment, and Commerce, Justice, and Science. And also, I think, probably the only member of Congress who was a business consultant. Is that pretty right? He is a member of Congress who he was a business consultant. And the other only member of Congress, I think, who went to divinity school and a chemical engineer. Chemist. So you have a unique mix here. Let me ask either of the House members if you wanted to jump in on that. Susan, do you have anything you wanted to add on that?
I think we also put a lot of things under the umbrella of trade, and there are a lot of issues we need to work on. We have issues of tax policy that have had a big impact on jobs in the United States and how companies operate. And so tax policy is going to be critically important for us to address to make sure we have an environment that keeps jobs here, that we deal with money being parked overseas. There are a lot of issues there. So I think right now everything, all the conversation goes under this umbrella of trade policy, and yet a lot of the issues we deal with respect to globalization come in other areas, and we need to make sure that people understand that because it impacts other areas of policy that aren't talked about quite as much, but are critically important to having a strong U.S. economy.
Congressman, do you think there's this, I mean, I look at this, and to me it's a kind of a no-brainer that we could organize an entire really progressive, forward-looking agenda around competitiveness in the next Congress. And if Secretary Clinton wins, if you have a president who clearly focuses on that, do you see the politics working possibly in this space?
Yeah, I do. And And I say that in part because every one of us goes back to our districts and the primary concern is having an economy that's working better. My background was both as a business consultant and I worked professionally in economic development. And in our office, we had a sign up on the wall that said, "We are competing with everyone, everywhere, every day, forever," which I always found slightly intimidating. But I actually think it's a pretty good ethic, not just for folks who work in local economic development in Tacoma, Washington. I think it's a pretty good ethic for our country, too. And the reality is the nations with whom we compete are not messing around with government shutdowns and sequestration, some of the frivolity we see out of Congress. They want to eat our lunch. And I think increasingly Congress needs to wake up and not let up. And there's no silver bullet to that. I think as Susan mentioned, that it's more like silver buckshot, right? There's a bunch of stuff you've got to do. Trade policy is a piece of that, tax policy is part of that, immigration and workforce issues. And and the reality is, we're not going to move forward on anything if we continue to be a Venn diagram that's 2 circles a mile apart from each other, right? Part of the science of this is finding that area of shaded overlap and at least moving forward on the stuff we can agree on.
Oh, that's great. So we have, it's 3 companies and one association, but all of the companies and then Jim, all of your members are global technology companies. You go out there every day and you have to fight for global market share and you compete, but increasingly you're competing against companies who are backed by their governments in oftentimes unfair, inappropriate, or what we would call innovation mercantilist ways. What do you see some of the biggest challenges there, and how do you think we should, as a country, should be working to fight back on? Brad, you want to jump in on that?
Sure. Well, first of all, Rob, I want to compliment you. Not only do you always do a great job with thought leadership, but just being thoughtful, and even with all of these folks who reflect public thought and public service, you've ensured that even while on stage, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft are going to be carefully supervised by the FTC. But we do live in a very competitive world, and I think there's 2 aspects that I will call out in this context that people on this stage and in this room are working on. First, I don't think that we can be competitive and successful globally unless we are producing technology that the world can trust. And that sense of trust, frankly, requires that we strike the right balance nationally and globally around issues like privacy and security and surveillance. And that's where people like Representative Delveni and Senator Coons have been playing, I think, such an important role in Congress. And that remains, I think, a vital issue for the next administration as it has been for this one. And then there's a second issue that I think just is fundamental to the country, fundamental to our companies in the industry. Look, we're only as good as the people we hire. And that's going to be true every year. And we need to hire more people in the United States. We need to hire more people in the United States with the right skills. That means more people who can code, who know computational thinking, who understand computer science, and that is no longer just an Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft question. 3/4 of the people who have these skills are being hired by companies that are not in our industry because every industry is relying on this technology. We are behind as a country. We're falling farther behind, I might argue, when I look at what, say, the United Kingdom is doing in getting coding and computer science into every class, in every grade, in every school. And we in our industry are doing a lot. Facebook just a week ago announced a $15 million commitment to code.org. Amazon has somebody on that board, Jeff Wilkie, I'm on that board. But as some of these folks know, we need help from Congress. We need federal support to help train teachers, to train students to learn these subjects, and that is as vital to our national competitiveness as anything else.
We just issued a report on computer science education and reform, and one of the, I think, the most interesting factoid was that there are more kids in California, high school kids, who take pottery than take computer science. And that's because pottery jobs pay a whole lot more than CS data analytics jobs. We all know that. Erin, do you want to say anything to that?
Well, Brad said it all so eloquently. So I'll make 2 points. Facebook's mission is to create a more open and connected world. We think there's a real opportunity to lift people out of poverty, to improve healthcare, to improve education, when we can connect people to issues, communities, and information that matter to them. And the free flow of data obviously is critical to that mission. And just sort of picking up on your first point, certainly we are concerned about data localization efforts, countries that want to sort of hold data within their borders, when many companies like ours, again, we have an infrastructure that knows no border, and data flows, and we need to have data flow. And this is why, for example, we work so hard on Privacy Shield, just like the FTC, to make sure that we can have these international arrangements between, in that case, Europe and the United States, where data can flow in a privacy protective way. And so that's really important, is the free flow of data. The other piece I want to pick up on is certainly, Brad talked right about education and training, but also connectivity. And this is something that I know is part of, we had a meeting yesterday with the New Dems, and we talked a lot about connectivity and infrastructure as a key sort of pillar in their agenda. I think we're also looking at innovative ways, not just to sort of make sure we have infrastructure development, but also to deliver connectivity and services to people in a cost-effective way. So for example, Facebook has a free basics program around the world. We partner with mobile operators to bring, because a lot of people around the world, they may have access, but they can't afford the data charges when it comes to downloading different services. And so we're working and partnering to provide data at free or lower cost. So, and I think in the United States, we have a real connectivity gap. There's a big difference between the state of Washington and the state of Mississippi when it comes to connectivity. And we need to be doing more in the United States so that people can have those benefits that we talked about from internet access. So that's another key point. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. First of all, I want to echo the comments about education. We really need the government's help to address the need for STEM education in our schools. That's critical, and we also need to look at our immigration policy to make sure that we make it possible to have the best talent. So on both those fronts, we need help. I think the other thing I would pick up on is this notion. These aren't global markets. It's not just the U.S. And so we have to think globally. We want to make it possible so that a craftsperson in California can sell what they're making, not just to customers in the United States, but customers in India or customers in China. We really want to have commerce, and we also want to make a system where someone from the U.S. can use a cloud service and reach a global audience. That's not possible unless there are rules. There are rules to the game, and we can't enforce the rules unless there's a base set of rules. And so, I think we need the government's help in setting that baseline. One final point, picking up on Brad's trust point. One way to increase trust among the international community is to make it easier when law enforcement and governments are fighting threats to trade information and to communicate with each other and coordinate those efforts. I think one of the low-hanging fruit that the federal government helps with is performing MLAB, the process by which governments coordinate and communicate with each other when they're seeking information from companies like us about people who may be using our services. That's critical, and I think that will significantly move the needle on the ability to operate in a way that fosters trust.
If you haven't seen the Clinton technology plan, that plan does talk about the importance of reforming and speeding up the MLAT process, which, in your case, Brad, the decision released last week on the Microsoft Irish decision, part of that whole process, but that's really just a little part of the battle. We got to fix the underlying thing. Jim, not so much CS education, but certainly STEM education, also, again, on IP challenges really all around the world. A lot of countries want to become bio leaders, and some of them, like China, India, they want to take a shortcut to it rather than do the hard work. They'll take our hard work and exploit it. How do you see that?
Well, so competition for the biopharmaceutical industry feels very different from my other colleagues here. We dominate this field. 70% of all of the drugs under development right now are being developed by U.S. companies. And the other 30% are, for the most part, being developed to sell into the U.S. market. And the reason for that is quite simple, is because we have the closest thing remaining in the world to a free market when it comes to biopharmaceuticals. What I find when I talk to policymakers, and I just came from a Democratic Governors Association panel, just like this, we were really focused on drug pricing and so forth, so I was a bit on the defensive. What I find is that policymakers are kind of schizophrenic. They all say, I want to be a biotech hub, come tell me how I can make a biotech company, because all these jobs, they're the greatest jobs in the world. And we want innovation, we want to cure diseases and so forth. Can we have that for free? Can we have that really cheap? And the answer is no, you cannot, because this is about the highest, most risky enterprise in which you can try to participate. 90% of our companies do not succeed, they fail. 90% of the projects of companies fail, and 80% of the products that are ultimately approved by the FDA never recover their costs. So basic economics are, this stuff is going to be expensive for a while until it goes off patent, and it won't be. The system that we have in the US is driving all this innovation. But it's quite under threat, and the governors were saying, well, why should we have to pay more in the US for drugs than the rest of the world does? And my answer is, you don't. You can impose price controls, and it will do just like Europe and Canada. And all of the amazing science, which will in fact treat, prevent, and cure every one of the 7,000 diseases that are in the world eventually, because there's no stopping the science. There's no scientific reason why we cannot do that. In the world, if we thrive, if this industry thrives, not only will it be a boon to our economy and a boon to health, but we will actually reduce healthcare costs dramatically, because it's all healthcare costs are 86% chronic disease. Someone will say, well, you know, you're up to 15% of the healthcare spend. I would like us to be close to 100% of the healthcare spend. Because if we were 100% of healthcare spend, that would mean there's a drug for this, and you don't have to go to the hospital. So that's price controls, and particularly this year in this highly politicalized debate, is the greatest threat to our competitiveness.
No, we just released a study looking at a lot of the economic evidence on this, and there's a very good academic study that came out, I think, last year, that said if we had the European price regime for drugs, we would have had, I can't remember the exact number, apologies, something like 25% fewer compounds going into the market because of just the limited ability to make money. So I want to ask the commissioner, you know, we ran into each other over in Brussels a while back. You were over there working obviously diligently and successfully on the Privacy Shield. It's sometimes unclear why countries do what they do. And I'm willing to give the Europeans the benefit of the doubt on the privacy part. I'm not willing to give them the benefit of the doubt on some of the other things that some of the individual countries are doing. But what do you see the role of the FTC globally around issues like, for example, working to push back against overly aggressive antitrust enforcement, where you see that in China, for example, they use antitrust as a tool, a weapon really, for mercantilist practice. Really almost nothing. I mean, you've faced that. Many companies have faced that. What's the role of the FTC to help educate, push back?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here to supervise all of these competitors. Recognition. I'm going to just start with the usual FTC disclaimer, which is that I am a Federal Trade Commissioner, but today I'm not representing the FTC or the views of my colleagues. So I am, though, representing, I think, my personal views, and I like to think of it a little bit like representing consumers in this conversation. And I'm really pleased to hear the emphasis in this discussion so far on trust, because I think that is absolutely essential here. And it's a fundamental belief that I think we all hold dear in Europe and in the US and in other markets around the world. A lot of this conversation starts from the same first principles, but then we reach sort of different solutions during the course of it in the policy discussion. So the role the FTC is currently playing and has played for a long time is to represent first and foremost the approach that we've been using here in the United States, which I think has been incredibly supportive of innovation while also trying to protect consumers and competition at the same time, and to explain some of the lessons learned that we have from our process here. And then, as you point out, we are increasingly in a global environment when we're talking about competition for consumer protection. 20 years ago, I think there were a handful of jurisdictions that even had merger control laws and antitrust laws. Now there are over 120, and 30 maybe. So we're increasingly engaged in the daily international conversation on these issues. And I think one of the things that we try to reflect in a lot of the jurisdictions where we're having these dialogues is what are the right policies in order to optimize innovation, which is a lot of the conversation that we're having here this morning. And in my experience, a lot of the jurisdictions you're talking about in Europe and in Asia are really interested in also developing innovation policies that make sense. So we're trying to support those efforts and explain that, you know, also the U.S. is not the Wild West when it comes to consumer protection. We have strong protections. We have an enforcement-based approach. And I think, you know, we've been doing a relatively good job at it so far. More work needs to be done for sure. And I definitely think we should get to, in this conversation, to the security of the Internet of Stuff, because I think that's going to be a big issue for consumers going forward.
I want to come back to privacy and security in a minute, but before I do that, Rosabeth, we were having a conversation a little earlier about that, you know, these issues resonate with us. They resonate with the people in your book. You had that really good book about sort of globalists versus localists. I remember.
Well, that's another, yeah, world class.
Yeah, world class.
Yeah.
But they don't always resonate with what you might call localists, people who just live in a community and they're far away, maybe from Silicon Valley or other places. What does the industry need to do? How do we need to push this harder?
So I think that it, no, I mean, I'm not sure they were actually working, although it's fun to jump into it, whether it works or not. So I think that it's not clear that the public understands totally the relevance of tech investment for their lives, even though people are users. All the companies represented here, and of course, my home state of Massachusetts is definitely a big player in biotech. But people don't understand the relevance, why this is good for them. They see job displacement. They see artificial intelligence, robots, technology taking their jobs, and even if it makes it possible to manufacture in the U.S., which is so critical, people often see that it won't be done with people, it will be done with technology. So we have to do a better job of explaining the relevance, that relevance not only to members of Congress, but also to local and state officials. When I was at South by Southwest, I was with a group of mayors who were having their first rides in autonomous vehicles. To understand that they could actually get around safely and that they are going to have to be developing policies in their local areas to permit a lot of the fruits of new technology, because we haven't yet talked about transportation infrastructure. I do spot former Secretary of Transportation Rodney Slater over there. So great that you're here, because those fields are so important. And one of the ways we will create jobs of the future is not only by investing in infrastructure, because we have crumbling infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt. That's immediate jobs, and those jobs don't necessarily require STEM skills, but they should and they will, as technology increasingly is embedded in our infrastructure and should be. But meanwhile, we can put people to work, but we can also make it possible to create jobs of the future. If we're talking about manufacturing, if you can't move the goods, if you can't get to work in the morning, and those are things the average American thinks about, the length of their commute and how unpleasant it is in all of our booming areas. Seattle, as well as Boston, you can't move, literally. And all these booming areas, if you're not living exactly where you're working, that is destructive to family life. So even in the boom areas, we need infrastructure investments, and we certainly need them in the areas that are crumbling and are going to kill people. Think about that. A bridge collapsing kills people. We should care about that as people who are here at the Democratic Convention. And the costs of lost productivity because of people stuck in traffic, and the health costs from breathing the emissions stuck in traffic, are actually things people do care about.
I want to come back to that a little bit, particularly about how tech can help solve that. But I know, Senator, you need to leave. But I wanted to just ask you. You're right on the front lines of all this when you have to go back to Delaware and talk to your constituents and listen to their concerns and their worries. How do we do a better job? What's the role of Congress to help with this?
I've got a concrete example I use in Delaware to your point about manufacturing jobs. Laverne and Shirley. I may be in a room full of people old enough to remember Laverne and Shirley. There's this little brewery in Delaware called Dogfish Head Beer, which I hope all of you have heard of. The guy who started Dogfish Head, a craft beer, which has grown very quickly, spent $50 million on a new manufacturing facility in Milton, Delaware. It's a brewery it's a bottling line, it's a packaging plant. I was excited to go see it when it opened because I thought maybe there'd be 100 people working there, as there were in Laverne and Shirley, all standing right. There's 12 people working on that manufacturing line and a whole lot of robots. But every one of those 12 people has a good, solid, high-paying jobs. They're all from the local community. They are servicing and tweaking and making sure that these robots and packaging materials are running extremely well. There are truck drivers who are bringing things in and out. There's folks who are working in our local community sustaining the logistical supply chain. So yes, at times I have to say to folks who aren't as interested in or engaged in or as excited about the wonderful jobs Amazon has brought to Delaware, the wonderful opportunities that integration through Microsoft and Facebook and others makes possible, they remember that their mother or father worked on a bottling line. Those jobs are coming back to the United States, but they are technology-heavy jobs. They require a higher level of skill. They require, in many cases, coding, and they require, in many cases, teamwork and the ability to collaborate to solve problems. We still have one of the greatest workforces on Earth. We certainly have the greatest universities doing advanced research on Earth. And we can and should solve problems around immigration, skills, tax, and trade that allow us to take advantage of these current opportunities for us to compete more successfully. I love the way Derek puts it because we've got a lot of folks in Congress who forget we're not just competing against each other as parties, we're not just competing against each other as cities or communities, we are competing with the world. And when I was a kid, I was told, eat your dinner because there's starving kids in India and China and they want it, right? They're hungry. They want to eat our lunch. They are eating our jobs. And if we can't connect with the average American about not just inventing things here, but making them here, it's hard for them to see this future. In little old Delaware, AstraZeneca is doing world-class pharmaceutical research, but they're also manufacturing. They're one of our best, highest quality manufacturers in Delaware. And I emphasize that every time I talk. Globalization and trade, led by innovation, can be a winning outcome for American workers. We just have to be better at trade enforcement. We have to be better at communicating. It's very real, positive impact for working families. Thanks for a chance to be with you.
Thank you, Senator. It's very nice. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for all your leadership on these issues, particularly manufacturing and competitiveness. I want to just ask, to turn over to Congressman Kilmer for a second. You represent a district that, at least in part, you wouldn't call high-tech, lumber mills and things like that. How do you talk about this issue there? What are the kinds of things we need to do as a country? I know, again, not to push the Clinton agenda, the initiative too much, but I did think one of the distinguishing features of that initiative was the emphasis on bringing innovation to communities that may not be the kinds of communities we think about right now when we think innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess there's two directions to go with that. One is just talking about how technology changes people's lives regardless of where they live. We talk about that under the umbrella of basic research, right? I point to people's cell phones and say, the lithium battery that powers it, the touch screen that allows you to navigate on it, the search engine that helps you find a delicious Thai restaurant for dinner, and the GPS system that helps you navigate your way there. All of the basic research behind those innovations was funded by the exact same venture capitalist, Uncle Sam. And so part of the reason you've seen Democrats lean in on basic research issues is because that basic research both creates jobs in our area and also improves people's lives. But as you point out, there's innovation that may not fall into the traditional way of thinking. We're working, and actually Susan and I are working together on a bill that's focused on something called cross-laminated timber and innovative timber products, where we're looking at how you use smaller diameter logs to create large wood buildings that can be more seismically stable, less prone to fire, have a lower carbon footprint, and provide. It provides an opportunity for rural jobs to fuel urban development. And that's resonant to people because you know what we have in my area? A hell of a lot of trees. Right? I represent more trees than people. And yet we also have had a lot
They don't vote though.
Yeah, no, they don't. But we've had a lot of mills go down, and it's a really tough dynamic. And if you can provide opportunities for those communities, innovation means something in Port Angeles, where I grew up too.
Now, the interesting thing about that, the Finns actually lead that global industry now, and the reason they lead it is in part because of the public-private R&D partnership that they've had with the timber company. So we need to be following that model.
Yeah, it's some of that's, the largest builder in the United States is the government, and so looking at the government sort of priming the pump on the demand side. You've seen the Department of Agriculture have a tall wood building competition to try to just spark some innovation in that way. We're looking at providing some federal support for innovation in that arena. So there's a lot of stuff we can do to promote those sorts of opportunities.
And can I add a little bit? My district is a combination. It's got Redmond, Washington, so a home of a lot of folks who work in technology, as well as huge rural areas and agriculture. And I wanted to pick up on the education point in terms of bringing folks together in rural areas. So we have a STEM high school in Redmond, Washington, focused on STEM education, a public school, an incredible curriculum they put together. They partnered with a rural middle school in my district in Darrington, just outside of where a huge landslide took place a couple years ago in my district. And so not only are they focused on STEM education, they're also focused on sharing each other's experiences. So folks from the STEM school in Redmond have gone out to Darrington to work with middle school students to show them not only how to use technology and help them with coding and things like that they're learning, but also to tell them a little bit about what opportunities there are available and the types of jobs that they think of, their parents and others might have that they think of as common, but for folks in a rural community may not see. And then the middle school students have come to the STEM school, and they actually went to places like Google and to see what was happening there, to see that there are opportunities there. So it wasn't just about teaching them the code, it was also to give them that kind of taste of what might be out there. And the folks from Redmond who went out into the rural, and it's a more of a timber community, had the students take them through the forests and help teach them about the incredible, beautiful environment and the changes that they've seen. And so it's been an incredible partnership to hopefully create some aspiration and help folks in our more urban areas understand the opportunities in rural areas and innovation, and the folks in the rural areas to understand the opportunities they might have. I also, in rural parts of my district, we have advanced manufacturing composites, a composite manufacturer doing work for Boeing. It's in a rural area where they had, innovative leaders who's developed a company who are now doing great work there. There's also work happening to build energy facilities using or clean water facilities that it's actually been supported by folks like the Gates Foundation. They're building these water purification facilities that are being shipped around the world, right in a rural part of my district. And so when we talk about innovative opportunities, those can also be located in a place they need. There's a lot of great manufacturing technology and engineering capacity that's needed, but by putting these in a more rural area, they've created huge work opportunities, and for the manufacturers, they've had an excited workforce and an excited community to support them, and it's really made a difference. So there are a lot of opportunities there, and I don't think we talk about those as much.
I think those are phenomenal examples. They make it clear why America is already great. This is bubbling up everywhere. This is the future, but there are some elements to what you talked about. You talked about partnerships. Innovation occurs in an ecosystem. So for biotech, it isn't just like a lot of companies doing it on their own. They're doing it with NIH support. They're doing it with teaching hospitals. They're doing it in partnerships, R&D partnerships. They're doing it in partnerships with schools like you talked about. And so when we do policies one at a time as though it was in isolation, we miss the fact that innovation comes from communities in which there are connections across institutions, across industries, across companies, across sectors, and that's how we will continue to get wonderful examples like what you talked about.
Anybody want to jump on that? Aaron?
I just wanted to build on that. I mean, I think as companies, we have a responsibility. I mean, we talked a lot about public-private partnerships, and we certainly as companies bring people into entrepreneurship programs, understand what it means, and also we have to do a better job talking about it. I mean, how many people in this room know what artificial intelligence is? Okay, this is a pretty good room, but still, there's people in this room who don't. And I think, but I think for the average American, we have to make innovation understandable and resonate with them. I mean, artificial intelligence is about making us understand the world around us in better ways. It's helping in a variety of ways. And I think if we can talk to people and hopefully the Internet of Things can become the Internet of Jobs for them and in a way that resonates, that actually works. I think that's what we as companies need to be doing better.
Go to Brad and then everything around this issue of emerging technologies and trust.
Well, I would say on the emerging technology side of it, I think these comments have captured that frankly those of us in the private sector do stand on the foundation of what is built by the public sector. And we too often lose sight of that. And that's true for education, because education is a mostly public education in this country. It's really true, as Derek captured, with respect to basic research. Really this country won the Second World War in part because of the basic and then the applied research that came out of the universities in the country, and every decade since it has led the world in terms of great basic research, and most of what our companies have created has applied that research that came out of federal support from great universities. And we can talk about all the best autonomous vehicles in the world, but if we don't have great concrete and asphalt and steel, that they have great roads and bridges on which these cars will drive, then they're not going to go very far or very fast. And so, frankly, we just always have to remind ourselves as a country that greatness comes out of this sense of partnership and all of us playing these roles in a very positive way.
I'd like to comment on the ecosystem point of view because it's so very true in the biopharmaceutical industry. When I was in Congress, and I was for 12 years, somebody would wheel a child into my office and say she has an incurable disease. And my first reaction was, I'm for as much NIH money as possible. Being relatively naive about the fact that was one tiny component of the continuum. So yes, there's basic research at the universities, and then you have to have policies that encourage technology transfer and incubation and some small grants from the government to help seed these projects as they get through the valley of death. You have to have the venture capital community engaged. You have to have a regulatory system through the FDA that works, et cetera, et cetera. And so these things are completely interconnected. So the cautionary note that I would make to policymakers is when you have a system that's working really well, and as we are producing 30, 40, 50 new drugs a year with hundreds and hundreds in the pipeline, be very careful about throwing a wrench into one aspect of it because the whole system can collapse more quickly than you might think.
Yeah, and I want to turn to the Commissioner Biden. There's some folks standing also. There's a bunch of seats up here, so feel free to just come on up and have a seat. I just had one quick thing, though, on the science thing, Brad. We now, as a federal government, are investing less in science than as a share of our GDP than we did before Sputnik. And that's how far down we've come, and really critical to turn around. Commissioner.
Sure, and I have no idea if this is working, so sorry back there if it's not. I think of this, we were just talking a little bit about machine learning and AI and robots, and since there are a bunch of experts in the room, I'll just note for the record, I'm not conflating those things. I think they're all different, and algorithms are still yet different. But we're talking about these high-tech impacts on consumers and people. And one of the big fears here, of course, is the impact on the labor markets. But that's where I think innovation can actually be a real solution. I don't think robots necessarily are going to be replacing people in jobs. I think, as Senator Coons just mentioned, what's far more likely is we're going to see people collaborating with robots and they'll have good jobs. But what we need to do is be able to get those innovations into the marketplace. And that's where the consumer trust issue, I think, really matters a lot here. We've been having a big conversation in our country around security by design, privacy by design. I want to start bringing data ethics into this as well, so data ethics by design. And what those concepts mean are really building those values into product development from the beginning in the life cycle so that they're not a top-down, not a regulatory approach at the end, but something that is organic and in it from the beginning. Because at the end of the day, in order to get all this innovation, we need consumers to be able to trust these products. We want them to be in connected cars. We want them to be using drones. We want them to wear wearables on their body. We want them to, turn the internet light on their refrigerator, right? So, and I think adoption will happen, but we have to have clear, transparent answers for people on these issues.
David, before you I just want to ask Commissioner one. I think we've written a fair amount about AI, and we've talked about what we really love the way you frame that issue, particularly around there's some folks who are pushing for that you have to sort of turn your algorithm over to the public and have them inspected, which sort of A, would never work, and B, reflects the fact that algorithms are dynamic and they sort of self-mutate. And you've argued for something different about looking about privacy transparency and how we ensure that the outcome is the right. Do you want to just talk about that just for a moment?
Well, sure. I mean, I think this is part of a conversation, and I would defer to a bunch of the other experts on the panel on this. But it really reflects what the responsibilities are for the humans who are engaged in using the technology. What do you do when your apparently neutral algorithm starts kicking out some really unhelpful, maybe discriminatory results? What is
But
your
that's
reaction
never
to that?
happened to a company on the panel.
It's never happened. And I've never seen it as a federal trade commissioner. So what do you, what is the reaction when the tech, especially tech that is starting to get smart in and of itself, starts doing something that might be harmful or that isn't really what's intended? And I think that sometimes they're best positioned to deal with that in-house very quickly. Now, I will say, I also support strong enforcement on the back end when there are harms. So I think we have to have really both things in order to really address the issue.
David?
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more with your remarks. I just wanted to pick up one strand. First of all, I think it's commonly accepted that robots are not going to put the American workforce out of work. In fact, in the first instance, they're going to make the jobs that already exist even better and better for the humans. And then I think there's another way that the private sector can contribute to this transformation, and that is by investing in employees. One of the programs that we've experimented with at Amazon is one where we work with our fulfillment center workers to provide 95% upfront prepaid tuition to bring classrooms into the fulfillment centers and offer training in high-demand technology jobs that don't have anything to do necessarily with working at Amazon, but allows workers who may start their careers working in a fulfillment center to get the next job if they don't want to stay at Amazon. So I think there are ideas like that where companies can invest in employees. We've open sourced those materials and we're making them available freely to other corporations. We've had some success with that. Over 7,000 people have gone through that. And I think that's just the beginning. So I think we can take an educational role, a training role, to help improve the jobs and prepare our workforce to do those jobs.
So coming back a little bit, Congressman, on the sort of risk notion, there does appear to be a kind of higher level of fear and uncertainty among Americans on this current generation of technology, much more so in the 90s. You didn't hear anybody say, oh, this internet thing, we've got to stop it. But you do hear people who I will go unnamed who talked about AI as an existential threat to humanity, which is just literally ludicrous. And you hear the same point about AI and robots going to kill jobs, which again, the economic evidence is crystal clear. It's the opposite. Higher rates of productivity lead to more jobs and then not fewer. So can you, before I turn to you guys, I want to introduce Congressman Peters. Congressman, thanks for joining us. We've had an interesting conversation about tech and competitiveness, so we're glad you can join us. Folks in the audience, Congressman Peters represents California's 52nd district since 2012, which is northern San Diego. Serves on armed services and judiciary, and has in a real, in his short time in Congress, really been sort of laser-like focused on a lot of these technology and innovation questions. So thank you for joining us.
Well, one, I think that as people have used technology now, we've also seen some challenges. We've seen bulk collection of data by the NSA, we've seen hacks and people's personal information compromised. And so I think people have had legitimate concerns about what's happening to their information and how that's being protected. We've seen laws like the Electronic Communications Privacy Act from 1986 that haven't been updated to reflect the way the world works today. So a piece of paper in your file drawer may be protected by warrant standard, but a piece of digital information may not. And so now people are starting to understand a little bit more that there is a disconnect sometimes between how we look at the physical world and how we look at the digital world. As policymakers, we need to be better stewards of policy and update policy so that there is that consistency. So for example, something as simple as having a warrant standard for electronic information, just like we do for physical information, is in place. But that was a 1986 law. We still haven't updated it. We finally passed legislation in the House this year after years of working on it, and Scott sits on the Judiciary Committee with me. We finally got legislation through the Judiciary Committee just to update that warrant standard issue. And when it got on the floor of the House, not a single no vote. So we are moving forward. We just need to move more quickly on some of these issues. And frankly, a lot of our technology issues aren't partisan. And so we really have the opportunity to bring folks together to address these issues. But educating lawmakers is critically important because I think some of the hesitancy that we see from folks moving forward on updating policy is because they aren't quite sure they understand it well and don't know exactly how to move forward. That's why one of the reasons Congressman Issa and I started the Internet of Things Caucus was to start educating lawmakers on what technology there is today, where it's headed, and how policy may or may not impact that innovation. Because clearly, as folks have talked about, we want to allow innovation to continue to move forward. We also want to make sure we protect people's personal information, so privacy is critically important. Issues of interoperability are important. Security and it is incredibly important. These are issues we need to discuss and understand. And as I know the commissioner has worked on too, now people want to know when they buy a product. Maybe they used to buy a watch and they look at the physical attributes of the watch and decide where they want to buy it. Now folks want to know what happens to the data that my band or Fitbit is sending out, and is it being protected, and how do I as a consumer make a decision on that? So I think to make sure that folks have the opportunities of technology and also know that there are appropriate protections and education is in place, that's really going to be critically important to see some of these innovations.
All right. Well, before I just ask the Congressman Peters to weigh in, Commissioner, you want
I just want to follow up on the points that the Congresswoman is making, because I think they're exactly the right ones around consumer trust, which is the FTC first got involved in bringing privacy enforcement cases 20 years ago when there was a thing called the World Wide Web, and consumers were worried about using their credit cards on it to buy stuff, right? So this has been an ongoing consumer issue for a long time. It is still our top #1 consumer complaint for the last several years, that identity theft is a big problem. So we haven't totally solved it, and that's just on transactions mostly. And now we are consumers who are using products in our daily lives. It's a far more significant issue when someone's able to turn on a camera in your bedroom and watch you, or even take over your car and drive it for you. And I think that's why the trust and the scope of that issue is actually getting bigger, just like the data and the agency.
Congressman, do you want to weigh in on that? Whether ECBA or other issues related to that?
Apologize for being late. I was on another panel talking about moderate issues. Usual demand for that during this week. What I think is interesting about the Judiciary Committee is I now think that in the next 5 years that the lawyers are going to have a much more challenging time on this than the engineers have had creating these technologies, because the implications for the First Amendment and Fourth Amendment are really profound, and they're not done. You're going to take a bunch of votes, you're going to say, we got that behind us. We will not be done with this conversation. Because in the face of all this terrorism and these breaches, and I'm really sorry what I said about you in those DNC emails, Derek, I apologize. I think it's really fascinating, and I do think that the other frustration for people who are in the business community is that Washington's not set up to be dynamic and innovative. People ask me what's the biggest surprise about Congress, and I always say it's not the glamour of United Airlines or the wonderful weather in DC. It's the culture, and a lot of us live in naturally collaborative, cooperative environments where innovation can come forth and we can take care of solving tomorrow's problems. That's not the way DC set up. As you know, DC set up to think backwards a little bit. It holds grudges. It's not the way we've always done it. It's what's your rank, not what's your idea. And so that's a real challenge for those of us who are concerned about this in this culture, to try to bring more of that innovative culture to DC. But I think the legal issues in this for lawmakers are going to be really fascinating in the next 5 years, in addition to all the challenges that the commerce has.
I want to just raise one other point to discuss, and then we're going to open it up for some questions or comments from you all. Congressman Kimball, you talked a little bit about public-private partnerships. We haven't really talked that much about it. Oftentimes the discussion is sort of how can government make sure that they don't do the wrong thing, how can they set up generalized frameworks. But in a lot of these technologies, Commissioner, you talked about ID theft, identity theft. Identity theft is really a problem that is not easily, but it is a problem that can be solved by technology if we went down the path that Estonia has done, which everyone has a digital certificate, a digital ID. You radically reduce identity theft when you do that, because then I can give you all my social security number, 914-324902. That actually doesn't it. In other words, the social security number becomes meaningless. That is no longer the identifier, and that's why we have identity theft. We see the same thing with transportation, where there are huge opportunities to embed digital technologies in pipelines, in water systems, in roads, in transit. We see it in healthcare. Big opportunities to modernize our healthcare system through IT. Another one is some of these issues around payments and fintech, where if the government were a lead adopter on some of these things, and say, the government itself is going to adopt these cutting-edge technologies. How do we do more? Well, first of all, I guess the question, should the government be thinking about those things? Clearly, you want to make sure you draw the line at the right place and don't go too far. But a good example is IoT. We just released a report on Monday where we had interviewed about 20 different agency CIOs and other leaders in all the federal agencies, from defense down to interior, and asked them, what are you doing on IoT? And the answer was, frankly, not very much. In part because we don't understand it, we feel the risk-reward ratio is out of balance because we might make a mistake, we can't get the right people, and yet the federal government should be leading IoT, because then it helps the overall IoT industry and adoption.
One of the things we've been focused on in the Internet of Things Caucus right now is initiatives on smart cities and smart communities. And I was speaking with a bunch of mayors recently too, and I think we've seen historically investments in IT projects haven't always paid off for government. Invested a lot of money and not necessarily have successful implementations. And things like the US Digital Service and others have really been great at bringing that public-private partnership together, bringing skills in and helping update the way government looks at and uses technology, so that it's not just one project that's siloed, that's done, that's never updated, a ton of money gets spent and you don't get the result you want. And that's why I think many legislators from local government all the way through the federal government are very concerned about spending money on IT or technology generally. And we have gone from a place where technology was kind of a nice to have to being a must have, to being part of infrastructure, and folks need to think about it that way. But we have to look at everything from procurement all the way through to making sure we share information so that people know what types of technologies might work. So when we look at the Internet of Things, and frankly we have draft legislation as well on smart communities that we're working on in conjunction with folks in the Senate, so that we have grant programs and understand pilot programs so we get best practices, so that if you're a mayor and you want to look at some type of system, folks are doing everything from smart trash cans to looking at parking to lighting and traffic flows. Maybe you have some best practices from others that have gone through it. You understand what the ROI might be, or what types of savings you might have, or what to watch out for, and these work well in these scenarios, but not so well in these scenarios. That's the kind of collective knowledge that I think will be critical, because a lot of our local communities don't want to be the beta testers, especially if it costs them a lot of money and doesn't work out well. And so I think the public-private opportunity there is for folks to work together and collectively understand those best practices so that people know what types of technologies might be most successful.
Great. Congressman.
The other example of that is a bill that we've worked on with ITIF that's focused on data and access to data and a presumption of openness with regard to government data. So quick example, how many of you checked your weather app before walking out this morning? All right, so the information from that is based on government data from NOAA. You know, and you've seen tremendous innovation in all sorts of arenas by being able to access that data. Everything from your weather app to, you know, the most popular surfer app is based on government data, where you can find out where the big waves are going to hit. And yet, government is still a little behind the curve when it comes to, one, creating a repository for that data. And so we've got a bill that would basically try to put data.gov on steroids and establish that. Create a presumption of openness with regard to data. Continue to protect things that need to be protected, but rather than every agency sort of hoarding their information, actually making sure that that's available to other government agencies, to researchers, and to private industry. And you know, I was asked, so what do you presume private industry will do with it? And my answer was, beats the heck out of me, and that's what's cool about it, right? Maybe they will come up with stuff we haven't even thought of yet. In the government arena, though, you know, imagine if there had been better attentiveness to things like wait times at the VA. And if you actually, and in the educational arena, we've heard conversation around an education scorecard to look at how our colleges and universities are doing. Providing access to that information, I think, can both make government work better, provide better value to taxpayers, but also drive a tremendous amount of innovation.
I want to turn over to Brad, but I just want to ask you, what's the status of that legislation now?
You know, so the good news is, well, I mean, Congress is not exactly a legislative juggernaut right now, but the good news is it's a bipartisan and bicameral bill. So I think we've got a shot at seeing forward motion.
I was just going to say, I think that there is a wonderful opportunity for new creativity when it comes to public-private partnerships. And I think it calls on those of us in the private sector, first of all, to recognize what I regard as sort of the unique role and responsibility of those in the public sector, because nobody elected us, they did elect you, or they elect people who appointed you. So it's very important for us, I think, to ensure that public-private partnerships move forward in a way that ensure that kind of public accountability. But I think there's also an amazing opportunity, and I think President Clinton captured it last night, because what he really spoke to is the opportunity for public service by people who are not in the public sector. So we can come together in new and creative ways to help contribute to solutions to the country's problems. You know, one concrete example that I'm very passionate about, it's in our home state of Washington, that 4 of us represent, is to enable more young, underprivileged people to go to college and get a degree in one of these high-demand STEM disciplines. Because we have the only public-private partnership in the country where private contributions are matched by the state of Washington. We now, through that, raised almost $200 million that, you know, this year will go to 2,000 students, over half of whom are people of color, to get degrees in this field. And I happen to chair the board at the appointment of our governor, and Microsoft's been the biggest contributor. But what I love about it is it brings us together in new creative ways to do, you know, what everybody says is so hard, and that is sort of build these kinds of bridges that span the different parts of society.
If I could, I'd like to give an example of a public-private partnership in the biotech space that's highly data-driven. So if, for instance, you look at Alzheimer's disease, and we know the tsunami of cost and suffering that's already with us, but just building up in terms of the baby boom generation. Our companies have spent hundreds of millions, probably billions of dollars trying to develop medicines that would prevent or treat, if not cure, Alzheimer's, and without much success, frankly. 98% of the clinical trials have failed. One of the reasons for that is because by the time a patient begins to exhibit symptoms of Alzheimer's, there's so much neurological damage that's already occurred that it's very hard to intervene with a therapeutic and reverse that damage. So that begs the question, how can we diagnose this disease earlier, right? And we don't really know yet. But so this conversation, and Bio was a big part of it, with Francis Collins at the NIH, has led in part to this precision medicine idea. And behind that is a very large longitudinal cohort. So there was the, I'm blanking on the one in Massachusetts years ago, the Framingham study. 5,000 people, because President Eisenhower had a heart attack and they were trying to figure out why. He was smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, which might have something to do with it. But from that little 5,000 person Framingham study, we studied the parents longitudinally and then their next generation and their grandkids. And we've learned a tremendous amount just about cardiac issues. So now the idea here is you take 1 million people and as many as possible sequence their genomes. And these people would be from 0 to 100 years of age. And then you give them diagnostic tests periodically, highly sophisticated diagnostic tests. And then when they begin to develop the symptoms of not only Alzheimer's, but all kinds of developmental chronic diseases, you can take that data and correlate it back to the genetics and other biomarkers and say, oh, now we see that it's this cohort of people that we're showing these proteins and these symptoms very early, and now we have a new place to intervene, and that's a wonderful example, I think, of a private and all of this data being available to the private sector to mine and learn from and develop hypotheses and clinical trials.
Yeah, and people can actually sign up for that now. There's just an article, I think, in the Post of the Times about that. So I want to open it up for questions really from the media, but Rosa, did you want to just jump in?
Just quickly to say that public-private partnerships can also help us pay for some of the big investments. Because there's a lot of money that would like to invest in U.S. infrastructure and need to feel that there's some political stability and some commitment on the part of government to make that possible. So some of these things are let 1,000 flowers bloom, lots of entrepreneurs with ideas bubbling up, but some have big price tags. And if we are better at public-private partnerships, that's a potential source of additional capital. And Secretary Clinton has talked about a $275 billion investment in infrastructure out of the box as her boost the economy plan. Not nearly enough. And she's also talked about public-private partnerships.
Great. Questions from, go right here, right in the front row. I'll wait for the mic.
Thank you for taking my question. I should note that in the technology realm, I've been G-chatting our tech reporter back in the office who is watching this on live stream, so thank you for that. And this is the question that he wanted to know, mainly for the business types. I think Brad might be the person to answer this question. You all talked about how you needed more education of, computer science type education in our schools. I did not hear anything about immigration, and I'm wondering if that means you've just given up.
Never give up. I think that, I'll just speak for our own company, but I think we all have views, and Mark Zuckerberg's been a tremendous leader, as have a number of people. We believe in the importance of having comprehensive immigration reform in this country. We believe in the contributions that are being made every day today by people who live here, who are law-abiding citizens, who work hard. Some of them have great educations and are here on an H-1B visa or a green card. Others are not. They have come here and they've lived here a long time. It's difficult for Congress to get things done, but 2013 did show the way in the Senate. It showed that the two parties could come together. This is obviously not going to be the year when the two parties come together, but There's always next year. And we believe in the importance of high-skilled immigration coupled with investments in education. We believe in the importance of not only creating jobs in this country, but filling them in this country. We recognize that if we can't fill them in this country, they're probably going to have to go somewhere else. And I think as an industry, you've seen us take a strong stand, not just for our own employees and our own needs, but more broadly. I think, as an industry, we appreciate the importance of diversity in this country. That's what has made this country unique in the world. We reflect the population of the rest of the world, and we need to continue to build on that.
It is interesting also that the Clinton's tech plan did have the statement in there, capable green card to the STEM diploma. Which,
absolutely, and there were so many, frankly, good ideas reflected in the bill that the Senate passed in 2013, and that's, we would hope, might provide a starting point for the future, but we'll see what the future holds next year. But I certainly wouldn't interpret silence as anybody giving up.
Yeah, that was a little
That's what a good reporter does.
I'm going to go somewhat in the order I saw this gentleman right over here with the hand up. Yeah, and you want to just wait for the mic, please.
Thanks for putting on the forum. Chris Lewis from Public Knowledge. And thank you to Representative Delmetti and Commissioner McSweeney for talking about the importance of trust from consumers, which is something we heard about a lot. One thought that hadn't been mentioned, we heard about infrastructure, we heard Representative Kilmer talk about the importance of open data and access to data, but no one mentioned the importance of making sure that everyone has access to infrastructure when it comes to broadband. Everyone has access to data and research when it comes to building off of existing research. And so I wanted you folks to comment on the opportunities to improve in that area.
Sure. I think it's a really big deal, and I say that as someone who represents a district that has a lot of rural communities. Despite the fact that we sit in Washington State, which is this hub of innovation, the district I represent ranks in the bottom quintile with regard to access to high-speed internet. I just want to give an example of how that plays out. I visited with one of the leaders of one of the Native American tribes in my district, and he said, "You want the good news or the bad news?" I said, "Tell me the good news." He said, "Every one of our high school seniors graduated this last year." I said, "That's awesome." I said, "What's the bad news?" He said, "Well, this next year, for the first time, the state of Washington is going to require that the exam required for graduation be taken over the internet." He said, "We don't have access to high-speed internet." He said, we sampled the test, and it's one of those where you answer 10 questions and click next page. He said, we went through it, and he said, it took 1 minute and 44 seconds to get to the next page of questions. And he said, so we're going to bus those kids 2 hours away to the nearest community that has high-speed internet. They're going to take the exam in an environment that they've never been in before. And that becomes an issue of access to justice, to educational justice, and to economic justice. One of the ways that we overcome geographic isolation and geographic remoteness is through technology. And so cracking the code on this of improving access to high-speed internet, I think, is incredibly important for rural communities.
I just want to jump in, since we've covered high-speed access really eloquently by the Congressman, and say that there's another aspect to your question here, and to me it's a part of data ethics by design, which is what is the quality of your underlying data? And does it have big gaps in it? And is that causing some kind of problem? It's all well and good when there's like a Pokestop desert, okay? That's maybe just inconvenient for people. But there's some pretty real-world consequences to the quality of the data, and we know that we have problems in some of these large data sets. And that's one of the issues the FTC has been very focused on.
Yeah, my colleague Daniel Castro wrote a report recently on confronting data poverty, which was exactly that, to make sure that all parts of the country and all demographics had sort of equal data representation, if you will. So right here in front row.
Hi, I'm Maggie Reardon from CNET. And I wanted to ask the companies who are represented here and also the FTC. Right now, the FCC is considering some rules on privacy for communication companies like Verizon and wireless companies, broadband companies. that would not carry over to a Facebook or an Amazon. Is that a problem in terms of how we look at regulation for privacy and trust for consumers, that, you know, the communications companies have one set of rules, whereas companies like Facebook and Amazon follow a different set of rules?
I'll take the first cut, and then I'll listen very carefully to the Commissioner's answer.
That's the right answer.
I think, you know, our approach has been famously to be customer-centric. We start with the customer and we work backwards. And so I think when regulators look at a problem, they kind of have to do the same thing. They have to start with customers and they have to work backwards, and they have to identify what are the real concerns. It's true that AI is different from machine learning, it's different from robotics. Those people tend to talk about some of these issues in very broad brush ways, and I think the same goes in other parts of the technology sector. When you say, you know, we're looking for communications regulation, that's not good enough. We need to look at the actual customer-company interaction and figure out whether there is a problem. So I think if we start with customers and look where customers are being harmed, you know, it's the best framework for approaching enforcement, approaching regulation. And you know, if we're starting with customers and we're thinking about them first, that's going to lead to the right answer. In terms of the specific regulations that are being debated, you know, I think there too you need to look at very specific examples and see where the problems are and approach them in context-specific ways.
I think that makes sense. I think that it is about context, and I think that, you know, the FTC certainly has a robust, as the Commissioner talked about, robust enforcement regime, and as does the FCC, and as I understand, the agencies work very closely together, and so the privacy regimes are likely, and these principles of privacy, we've been talking about these principles that underpin, I think, both with the FCC as well as the FTC, as well as internationally, there are, you know, fundamental principles that I think will carry over regardless of the agency.
So I'll just give you a brief FTC perspective that is mine alone and maybe not even shared by my colleagues. One is that, look, until someone passes a law giving the FTC jurisdiction over common carriers, we don't have jurisdiction in many aspects after the reclassification on activities of common carriers. And so I think it's important for the FCC to step in and set some rules and have some clarity. The FTC has commented in the rulemaking process, and I think what we've said in that comment is that having different sets of rules isn't optimal, but we're very focused on making sure that consumers have choices, and particularly have choices around content and information of theirs that is sensitive. And we need to continue to have that dialogue. I think there's a lot more work to be done in this space, and I think that it's going to be a big policy conversation and a big legislative conversation that we need to have going forward.
So I think it's partly related to what Congresswoman Delveni said about ECFA and really about the principle of technology neutrality and business model neutrality. And I think that's a pretty important concept that I would have apply to this case as well. So I think we have time for one more question, and then right here. And then I want to ask everybody if you can sort of think about your closing 1-minute statement to sum up and where we've been and where we should go.
Thanks. Rebecca Arbogast, head of Global Public Policy at Comcast NBC Universal. Just wanted to pick up a couple of threads and then ask you guys all a question. So one on the privacy question, just to echo, I think the general underlying point that Facebook and Amazon made, which is PPI did a study, I don't know when it was published, a couple of weeks ago, that Peter Hart, the Democratic pollster, had done, and they found that consumers, I think like by 90% or more, wanted a consistent privacy framework. They wanted to not have to parse out who was using the data. They wanted the data to be similarly, and then similar to what Commissioner McSweeney said, they wanted sensitive data to be treated more carefully than others. So I think that there's a general consensus on the core principles, and it's important that we get it right at the end. On a key important question, your story is heartbreaking about the tribal lands that don't have the ability to serve their people. The one other thing I would commend the Clinton Tech Initiative for is focusing on the need to fix that. We've had, I came from the FCC as a regulator at one point, we've had a universal service system in place for decades that isn't, don't quote me, that isn't doing what it needs to do, right, to get everybody connected. And Chairman Wheeler and some other folks have made the comments, and folks at Brookings have made the comment that we have connectivity access to like 93% of the country with speeds, and that final 7% that we really have got to do something about. It's tragic and it's unconscionable that we have these situations. And then finally, the point about you have the access, but you need to be able to get onto it, and so we all need to be doubling down on the adoption point, because 93% have access, but only 70-some% are actually signing on. So we need to do that. The question I had for you all was, and I'm thinking about the adoption piece on public-private partnerships. We as a company work very closely with local folks. It's like very hands-on local groups that are getting people online. So we've seen the local, we talked about the federal. Are you guys seeing anything, either academic researchers, Commissioner, with your conversations with your companies that have global presence, really wonderful projects or policies that you're seeing that other countries, other regions of the world are taking that we may want to take a look at?
Anybody want to jump on that? Certainly India is not.
I think there are. You haven't given it a huge amount of thought. I'll just jump in. I think that there are probably several examples that I'm not calling to mind right now. We also have some examples of good partnership around consumer protection issues here in the United States as well. And so I think we do take steps, and industries take steps to promulgate some self-regulatory rules of the road, which can be very helpful, especially when we're dealing with highly dynamic issues in highly dynamic spaces. One of the things that I care a lot about as a federal trade commissioner is whether those are adequate to protect consumers from the harms that consumers are most concerned about.
Actually, Roosevelt, I'm going to ask you to request because we're running out of time. So, closing statement, thoughts you'd want to share with us before we go.
Me first?
You first.
Okay, well, I was gonna, so I won't answer the other countries. I mean, this country really has a lot going. There's no one other country that's better on every dimension, but we can find models in the Nordics, we can find models in South Korea, there are models everywhere. But what I wanted to say is one thing I'm taking away from listening to a lot of wisdom here, which is wonderful, and a lot of dilemmas and challenges ahead, that we are in the midst of major change. And so we're in transition in the economy. And, well, when you have a lot of change, you need a change maker.
Which you can buy on Amazon.
Way to tie it together there. We've been actually, House Democrats, we've been working on an innovation agenda. There was an innovation agenda that was put together almost a decade ago. And it had a bunch of policies that were important, and everything in there, including great successes like investments in ARPA-E, et cetera, were things that moved forward. And probably the one big plank of that agenda that didn't pass was immigration reform, which is a plank that's going to be there again. But we held roundtables throughout the country, and one thing that I think is incredibly important that came up very much definitely in our region, but is echoed across the country, is the ability to think long-term again and to take risk. We've gotten to a place where even our investments in places like NIH and NSF have been more risk-averse. We have young scientists who aren't having the same opportunities because they're not proven and they're not having the same ability to access grants, and those are the people who are going to have the next great breakthrough in medicine or in technology. And we know some of our best learnings and innovation come from the things that don't work the way we expected, and they help inform us about what we might do next. And those dollars that we spent a decade ago or 2 decades ago are the ones that are giving us a return today. And so being able to make those long-term investments again, Congress has a short-term horizon, and I think there's concerns in innovation when you have a short-term focus, but also making sure that we are willing to take those risks in innovation to try out some big ideas. Those are things we've been willing to do in the past, and we've got to make sure are important ways we move forward.
Great. Jim, final couple of thoughts?
Sure. So my final point is biotechnology has, and at an accelerated pace, is going to dramatically transform healthcare. Cell therapy, gene therapy, using our own immune system to destroy cancer in our bodies. The CRISPR technology is so exciting and so dramatic and will, without a doubt, dramatically reduce human suffering, extend longevity, and save our economies and our governments trillions upon trillions of dollars, unless my friends and colleagues in Congress, this is one who's a good one, and both of these other two are as well. Coons is fabulous. But unless Congress, if Congress undoes the system and throws a wrench in the reimbursement side of it thoughtlessly, all of that goes away, and that would be literally the crime of the century.
Bio-legislator of the year. And by the way, in genomics, if you want to think about privacy issues with genomics, it's so fundamentally different once we get into it. It's exciting, but also a challenge. I would say, obviously this Congress is kind of shut down for now, but I would be ready for a lot of activity in the next couple of years. Paul Ryan's very aware about tax reform. Maybe you talked about that before we got here. Incentivizing domestic job creation is really a fundamental concern there. What Derek said about broadband, that can be an important part of an infrastructure discussion. Most of the people talk about infrastructure and, oh yeah, also broadband. Make that a real mission of yours to make sure that that's a critical part of any infrastructure bill. That's a role you can play in this roads and bridges debate. What Derek framed it in terms of a justice, and I think that's one way to look at it, but it's really a workforce issue. I mean, we have to be educating our own people to be empowered to succeed in this new economy. And broadband is getting data to them is a real way is the most fundamental, foundational way to do that, because there's lots of ways to innovate around education, but if you don't have access to broadband, you can't get there. It's also an important response to the immigration debate, because there's a lot of people who are skeptical about having high-skilled people here. We have to be talking about how we're educating our own in addition to keeping people here. And I think there's going to be a lot of activity around that. And so you will be interested in the issues that confront you directly, like privacy versus security. There's a lot of issues that are going to come up that are going to affect you indirectly, and I know you'll play a leadership role in that, and we'll certainly need you to do that. Or to that.
Thank you. Erin, quick thought.
At Facebook, Mark has this saying of putting people first. And we talk a lot about putting people first. We talk about connecting people to the issues, the communities that matter to them, making sure people understand how their data is used. We came up with principles around algorithms and transparency and putting people in control. And I think just talking about today, putting people first when it comes to making sure they're educated, making sure that they understand that innovation works for them. They understand what the potential is about artificial intelligence or virtual reality, and then it works for them. So I think this notion of just putting people first was something that I was thinking about as everyone was talking, and something I want to leave us all with.
Did you come up with that phrase, by the way?
That's Mark's phrase, but I like using it. Put people first.
Somebody else also in 1992,
So we've been talking, I think, a lot about how we can get more innovation and not less, and I think that's really important for our economy in the future. From the consumer protection perspective, I want to say three things. One, consumer trust, and fundamental to that is data security and privacy. Two, competition and smart competition enforcement is going to be absolutely essential. And three, smart government. We need more technologists in government. And I think we need to make sure that as we're making the policy decisions and the enforcement decisions of the future, we have people who understand the technology that we're talking about at the table helping us make those decisions.
So just a couple of thoughts. First of all, I think it's the nature of panels like this to focus on our biggest problems and our biggest challenges. And it's too easy not to lose sight of the fact that the United States has actually done a spectacular job in fostering innovation, and some of the companies and the success stories in the room are proof of that. And so we need to continue that. We need to take stock of how that happened and learn those lessons and lean into them further. This technology is incredibly empowering. It's empowering to small businesses all around the world. It's empowering to new voices, new authors, new filmmakers, new musicians, to all of a sudden be able to reach global audiences. It's empowering to people who want to start a business, who can go to the cloud and no longer need the types of resources to start something new when they can just go pay as they go. Those are, as I said before, those are in global markets. We can't continue to succeed and empower all those people if we close ourselves off from external engagement with the rest of the world. And so we do need to lean into figuring out what the right rules are, both from a trust perspective, from a trade perspective, and figuring those out, creating baseline rules, so we can continue to lead and continue to break those barriers for entrepreneurs and authors and customers in the United States and elsewhere.
So Third Way put out a report earlier this year that I thought teed up the change in our economy in a really thoughtful way. It started off by talking about Kodak and said at its high point Kodak employed 160,000 people and now I think employs 4,000. And it basically covered every place the Kilmer family shops, right? It talked about Tower Records, where I used to go with my brothers when they were in college. Had $1 billion of sales, and 4 years later was liquidated. We used to go to church on Sundays with my kids, and then go hit the Borders bookshop in Gig Harbor, Washington, and watch my kids fart around on books. And my wife and I would drink coffee, and we'd occasionally buy something. And now Borders is, no longer. And I think what that has created is a tremendous amount of, obviously there's a tremendous amount of change, but it creates a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty can go a couple directions, right? It can go the direction of Donald Trump, where you galvanize that fear towards, wall building and creating a more simplistic approach. Or it goes the direction that we talked about today, right? Policy ideas for the innovation economy. And importantly, also policy ideas to make sure that that innovation economy works for everybody. And I think that's the challenge that lies ahead of it, and frankly, it's a big reason why I'm a Democrat.
Well, great. Just, on that point, I think part of the story is also about explaining better to Americans what's actually happened. Because even though we hear these iconic stories, we just issued a report last week or 2 weeks ago, and it used Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and it showed that the chance of an average worker getting fired or from a closure or a downsizing is 25% less today than it was in 1995. It's been going down every single year. But we don't feel that way. We feel it's been going up. And part of it's because of where you're going to land when you get to the new part of that. So I think to close on an optimistic note, I think there's two big things to be optimistic. One is just the amazing amount of innovation and technology that here on this panel and other places and all through the country. But also that it appears that there's this chance that Congress could actually work more closely together once the election's over, regardless of who wins, and really begin to tackle in an even more serious way. There actually were a lot of things passed in this Congress that people forget about. R&D tax credit, including for small companies, Trade Secrets Act, and there's a lot of things teed up, obviously, in Competes that you've taken a lead on, Congressman. So I think there's a lot of good reasons to be optimistic, and on that note, we'll close. I want to thank everybody here for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and please thank this great panel.